What if the alliance that shook headlines was never what it seemed? What if behind the handshakes, the smiles, and the carefully staged photos, one leader was quietly playing a deeper game? Today's story is not just about power or war, it's about deception, strategy, and how Kim Jong may have outmaneuvered Vladimir Putin when the world least expected it. When Russia found itself increasingly isolated on the global stage, the shift in Vladimir Putin's foreign strategy was not a matter of choice but necessity. Sanctions tightened, traditional partners grew cautious, and access to military supplies became more limited with each passing month. In that moment of pressure, Putin turned toward one of the few states willing to engage openly with Moscow, North Korea. On the surface, this move appeared bold and defiant, a signal that Russia still had allies ready to stand beside it. But beneath the symbolism lay a far more revealing reality. Russia needed North Korea far more than it was willing to admit. The war environment reshaped Russia's priorities almost overnight. Ammunition shortages, equipment losses, and the strain on domestic production created a critical gap that could not be filled through conventional suppliers. North Korea, with its vast stockpiles of Soviet era weapons and ammunition, suddenly became strategically valuable. This was not about ideological alignment or shared long term vision, it was about survival under pressure. The moment Putin reached out, the balance of the relationship subtly shifted because dependence, once established, changes the dynamics of power. What made this situation even more striking was how openly necessity drove the engagement. High profile meetings, public statements of friendship, and carefully staged diplomatic moments were designed to project strength. Yet, the very visibility of these gestures raised questions. If Russia truly held the upper hand, why was it broadcasting the relationship so aggressively? The answer lies in what was missing: options. With Western channels closed and neutral partners hesitant, Putin's strategic room to maneuver had narrowed, making North Korea not just an ally but a lifeline. This reliance also carried hidden risks. North Korea's value to Russia stemmed from what it could provide quickly, not from what it could guarantee long term. Ammunition and manpower support offered short term relief, but at the cost of increased vulnerability. Once a state becomes reliant on a limited number of partners, it loses leverage in negotiations. Every request becomes harder to refuse, every concession more costly. Kim Jong Un understood this dynamic well, and Putin's need only reinforced it. The most revealing aspect of this necessity driven alliance was how it altered diplomatic posture. Russia, a country accustomed to setting terms, found itself adjusting tone and expectations. Language softened, patience increased, and demands were carefully framed rather than forcefully delivered. These are subtle shifts, but in international politics, subtlety often signals weakness more clearly than public defeat. The hooks of this story are not found in what was said, but in what had to be done to keep the relationship intact. In the end, Putin's turn toward Kim was less about choice and more about constraint. It exposed the limits of Russia's strategic independence and highlighted how isolation can push even major powers into uneven partnerships. When necessity replaces strategy, alliances stop being balanced, and the side that needs more always pays the higher price. Kim Jong Un approached the relationship with Russia not as a junior partner seeking protection, but as a calculated strategist looking to maximize advantage. From the very beginning, his actions suggested that this was not an emotional alliance driven by ideology or solidarity, but a transactional arrangement designed to strengthen North Korea's position. While public narratives focused on unity against the West, Kim was quietly shaping the terms of engagement, ensuring that every promise carried value and every gesture increased his leverage. The most effective tool Kim used was ambiguity. Instead of committing fully or rejecting cooperation outright, he positioned North Korea in a space where expectations were raised but outcomes remained flexible. This approach kept Moscow engaged and hopeful while allowing Pyongyang to control the pace and scope of cooperation. The hook lies in this subtle maneuvering. When a leader offers just enough support to appear reliable, yet never enough to become dependent, the balance of power begins to tilt in his favor. Kim also understood that symbolism could be more powerful than substance. High profile visits, military parades, and carefully choreographed images sent a message to the world that North Korea was no longer isolated. For Putin, these images suggested reassurance and partnership. For Kim, they served a different purpose, elevating his international standing and forcing other global actors to take him more seriously. Every photo op became a bargaining chip, and every public handshake increased his diplomatic weight. Another layer of leverage came through controlled cooperation. By selectively offering resources, whether ammunition, logistical support, or political backing, Kim ensured that Russia's needs were acknowledged without being fully satisfied. This created a dynamic where Moscow had to return repeatedly to the negotiating table. Each interaction opened the door to new demands, whether in the form of economic relief, technological access, or political concessions. The question this raises is unsettling. Who was really setting the terms of this partnership? Kim's strategy also benefited from patience. Unlike leaders under immediate military pressure, he was not racing against time. This allowed him to wait, observe, and respond rather than react. In contrast, Russia's urgency weakened its bargaining position. When one side can afford delay and the other cannot, leverage naturally shifts. Kim exploited this imbalance with precision, allowing necessity to work in his favor while maintaining the appearance of cooperation. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Kim's leverage building was how quietly it unfolded. There were no dramatic ultimatums, no public demands, and no overt threats. Instead, power was accumulated through restraint. By offering limited cooperation and avoiding overcommitment, Kim preserved his independence while steadily extracting value. This form of influence is harder to detect but far more effective because it operates beneath headlines and beyond public scrutiny. Through calculated restraint, strategic ambiguity, and a deep understanding of Russia's vulnerabilities, Kim transformed a seemingly unequal partnership into an opportunity. What appeared to be support was, in reality, leverage carefully constructed over time, proving once again that in geopolitics, control often belongs not to the strongest player, but to the most patient one. The shift in the balance of power between Russia and North Korea did not happen with a dramatic announcement or a visible confrontation. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, as dependence began to flow in only one direction. At first glance, Russia appeared to be the dominant player, a major military power with global reach, engaging a heavily sanctioned and economically constrained state. But power in international politics is rarely defined by size alone. It is defined by leverage, timing, and necessity. And on all three fronts, the equation began to change. As Russia's military and economic pressures intensified, its reliance on external support grew more pronounced. This reliance altered the psychological and strategic dynamic of the relationship. When a state needs consistent support to sustain its objectives, it loses the freedom to dictate terms. The hook here is simple, but unsettling power does not disappear overnight. It erodes quietly, one dependency at a time. Each request made by Moscow, each expectation placed on Pyongyang subtly shifted control away from the Kremlin. North Korea, by contrast, was not under the same immediate pressure. Kim Jong Un was not fighting an active, large scale war, nor was he facing urgent battlefield deadlines. This difference in urgency created an imbalance that favored patience over speed. Russia needed results, North Korea could afford delay, and in geopolitics, the side that can wait almost always gains the upper hand. This is where the power shift became most visible, even if you noticed it at the time. Another critical factor was predictability. Russia's needs became increasingly clear: ammunition, logistical assistance, and political backing. North Korea's responses, however, remained deliberately uncertain. That uncertainty forced Moscow to remain engaged, cautious, and accommodating. When one side becomes predictable and the other does not, negotiations stop being equal. The hook lies in this contrast: certainty weakens leverage, while ambiguity strengthens it. This evolving dynamic also reshaped diplomatic behavior. Russia's tone toward North Korea became more measured, more respectful, and noticeably less assertive. Language that at once reflected authority began to reflect persuasion. Meetings were framed as partnerships rather than directives. These subtle changes signaled a deeper transformation. Great powers rarely adjust their tone unless they sense vulnerability, and such adjustments rarely happen without consequence. The power shift extended beyond bilateral relations and into the broader international arena. By positioning itself as a key support channel for Russia, North Korea increased its strategic relevance. Other states, whether allies or adversaries, were forced to reassess Pyongyang's role. Kim gained visibility, bargaining space, and indirect influence simply by being needed. The irony is hard to ignore. A country long defined by isolation was now shaping the options of a global power. What makes this shift especially significant is how controlled it was. There was no overreach, no attempt by North Korea to dominate the relationship openly. Instead, influence was accumulated gradually through restraint and timing. Russia's growing dependence became the foundation of Kim's leverage, while the absence of alternatives locked that dependence in place. This is how power truly shifts in modern geopolitics, not through sudden collapse, but through quiet recalibration. The moment one side needs the relationship more than the other, the balance is no longer equal, even if the headlines say otherwise. What appeared to many observers as hesitation or inefficiency was, in reality, a deliberate strategy built around delay. North Korea did not refuse cooperation with Russia, nor did it rush to fulfill expectations. Instead, it operated in the space between commitment and denial, where control is strongest. Delays in deliveries, vague timelines, and carefully measured responses created a rhythm that favored Pyongyang, not Moscow. The hook is clear and uncomfortable. When time matters more to one side than the other, delay itself becomes a weapon. Russia's situation made this tactic especially effective. Battlefield pressures, logistical strain, and political expectations meant that Moscow was operating under constant urgency. Every postponed shipment or unclear commitment amplified that urgency. North Korea understood this imbalance and used it skillfully. By stretching timelines without breaking promises, Kim Jong Un ensured that Russia remained engaged, patient, and increasingly dependent. The relationship stayed alive but always on North Korea's terms. What made these delays powerful was their deniability. Nothing was openly rejected. Every slowdown could be explained away through technical challenges, logistical hurdles, or diplomatic caution. This allowed Pyongyang to avoid blame while still shaping outcomes. The hook here is subtle but critical. A delayed yes can be more controlling than a direct no. Russia could not accuse North Korea of betrayal. Yet it also could not move forward without Pyongyang's cooperation. These calculated delays also forced repeated negotiations. Each pause created a reason for further talks, additional meetings, and new concessions. Instead of a single agreement with fixed outcomes, the relationship became an ongoing process. In such a process, the side that controls timing controls momentum. Kim used this to extract value incrementally, ensuring that every step forward for Russia required renewed engagement and additional compromise. Another layer of this strategy was psychological pressure. Uncertainty breeds caution. As delays accumulated, Russia had to plan around what might arrive rather than what would arrive. This weakened strategic certainty and reduced Moscow's ability to act independently. The hook lies in this dynamic. Uncertainty does not just slow action, it reshapes decision making. Over time, Russia's calculations had to factor in North Korea's pace, giving Pyongyang indirect influence over Russian planning. The delays also protected North Korea from overcommitment. By never moving too quickly, Kim avoided crossing thresholds that could provoke stronger international backlash or entangle his country too deeply in Russia's conflict. This preserved flexibility while still maintaining relevance. It was a balance between usefulness and restraint, and it worked precisely because nothing was rushed. What many interpreted as limited capacity or caution was, in fact, disciplined control. Delay allowed North Korea to remain indispensable without becoming exposed. It allowed Kim to benefit from Russia's need while avoiding irreversible commitments. Most importantly, it kept Moscow waiting, and in geopolitics, the one who waits is rarely the one in control. This strategy demonstrates a modern form of influence where speed is sacrificed for leverage. Power was not exercised through force or confrontation, but through timing. And with every delayed action, the balance quietly shifted further away from Moscow and closer to Pyongyang. The gap between what the world saw and what was actually happening became one of the most decisive elements of this relationship. Publicly, Russia and North Korea projected unity, firm statements, symbolic gestures, and carefully curated images designed to signal strength and mutual trust. But perception is a tool in global politics, and in this case, it was used to conceal an imbalance rather than confirm equality. The hook is simple yet revealing. When leaders invest heavily in appearances, it often means the reality behind them is far less stable. For Russia, the image of solidarity served a defensive purpose. It suggested that Moscow was not isolated, that it still commanded loyalty beyond traditional allies. For North Korea, however, the same image functioned as a shield. By appearing aligned with a major power, Pyongyang elevated its international relevance without making irreversible commitments. The world saw partnership, Kim saw positioning. That difference in interpretation mattered more than any public statement. What made this perception gap so effective was how convincingly it was maintained. Every handshake and joint declaration implied certainty, yet operational details remained vague. The hook lies in what was not clarified. When cooperation looks strong but specifics remain unclear, one side usually benefits from the confusion. In this case, ambiguity allowed North Korea to appear dependable while retaining full control over its actual level of involvement. Russia, on the other hand, was constrained by its own messaging. Having publicly emphasized the relationship, Moscow could not easily express dissatisfaction or pressure Pyongyang without undermining the narrative it had helped create. This trapped Russia in its own projection. The stronger the image of unity, the harder it became to acknowledge limitations behind closed doors. Perception, once established, began to restrict options. The international response further amplified this imbalance. Other states interpreted the visible partnership as a sign that North Korea had become strategically indispensable. That perception increased Pyongyang's value not just to Russia but to the broader geopolitical landscape. Kim benefited from reactions he did not even have to provoke directly. The hook here is striking sometimes influence not from action but from how others respond to an image. At the same time, the reality remained far more cautious and controlled. Cooperation advanced slowly, commitments stayed conditional, and flexibility was preserved. Yet, because the perception of unity dominated headlines, these limitations went largely unnoticed. This allowed North Korea to enjoy the advantages of alignment without bearing the full costs. Russia absorbed the pressure of expectations while Pyongyang managed the pace. This divergence between appearance and substance also shaped negotiations. Russia negotiated as if the partnership were essential and established. North Korea negotiated as if everything was still optional. That difference defined outcomes. When one side believes the relationship must succeed and the other treats it as adjustable, leverage naturally shifts. The hook is unavoidable. Belief can be more binding than obligation. In the end, perception became a form of currency. North Korea spent it carefully, gaining status, attention, and bargaining power. Russia paid for it by locking itself into a narrative it could not easily escape. The world saw alignment, strength, and defiance. Behind the scenes, reality moved at a slower, more selective pace, one that favored the side controlling expectations rather than fulfilling them. The most striking element of this entire episode is how little noise it generated while reshaping the strategic landscape. There was no dramatic rupture, no public accusation, no visible collapse of cooperation. Instead, Kim Jong Un achieved something far more effective, a silent geopolitical win. The hook here is unsettling. The most powerful victories are often the ones no one announces because announcing them would weaken their impact. Kim did not confront Russia, embarrass Putin, or openly defy expectations. Doing so would have drawn attention, forced reactions, and potentially united pressure against him. Instead, he allowed the relationship to continue just enough to remain relevant while quietly improving his position. Each step was small, but together they formed a pattern of advantage. Power accumulated not through action alone, but through restraint, timing, and selective engagement. This quiet success lay in how Kim strengthened North Korea's standing without triggering consequences. By avoiding overt escalation, he reduced the risk of additional sanctions or international backlash. At the same time, Russia's visible association with Pyongyang normalized North Korea's presence in high-level diplomacy. The hook is clear. Legitimacy does not always come from acceptance, it can come from necessity. Being needed by a major power changed how others viewed Kim, even if they did not admit it openly. Another dimension of this silent win was control over exposure. Kim never allowed North Korea to become indispensable in a way that would trap him. Support was offered, but never to the extent that withdrawal would be impossible. This preserved flexibility. Russia, meanwhile, grew more invested, more visible, and more committed to the relationship. The asymmetry was subtle but decisive. One side gained options, the other narrowed them. This dynamic also enhanced Kim's domestic position. International engagement on his terms reinforced his image as a leader who could command attention from global powers without compromising sovereignty. No dramatic concessions were made, no irreversible alignments declared. The message internally was strength without submission. Externally, it was relevance without exposure. The hook here lies in contrast. Visibility without vulnerability is one of the hardest balances to achieve in politics. The silence surrounding this shift was not accidental. By keeping outcomes incremental and avoiding clear turning points, Kim ensured that no single moment could be challenged or reversed. There was nothing for critics to point to, no single agreement to contest. Influence grew through continuity rather than disruption. This made the gains durable because they were woven into ongoing processes rather than tied to bold declarations. Russia's role in this silent victory was paradoxical. By seeking support and projecting confidence, Moscow unintentionally amplified Kim's leverage. Every public acknowledgement of partnership increased Pyongyang's value while binding Russia more tightly to the relationship. The hook is difficult to ignore. Sometimes the act of seeking strength reveals weakness, and that revelation reshapes power dynamics. What makes this outcome especially significant is that it required no force, no threat, and no confrontation. Kim did not win by overpowering Russia, but by outlasting its urgency. Time, patience, and controlled cooperation did the work that military pressure could not. The shift was gradual, almost invisible, but once established, it became part of the strategic reality. This is how modern geopolitical victories are often secured, not through loud triumphs, but through quiet positioning. Kim's success was not measured in territory or treaties, but in leverage, relevance, and freedom of action. And because it unfolded without spectacle, it may prove more resilient than victories declared with applause. So the next time you see world leaders smiling for the camera, remember this story: power isn't always loud. Deception doesn't always look like a conflict. Sometimes the biggest victories happen without headlines, and sometimes the one who looks isolated is actually the one in control. Kim didn't just play the game, he rewrote it.